right, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Advisory. This presentation is an introduction to the artwork that's now hanging on the stage in Angela Hall. I can't tell you how excited and grateful I am to have the opportunity to share this artwork with you. Today, I'm going to talk about three main topics. First, I'll tell you about what inspired me to make this artwork and the importance of knowing your why. Second, I'll walk you through my creative process, including research, prototyping, feedback, and revision. These steps don't always follow each other in the same order. In fact, during the creative process, I jump between them all the time. And lastly, I'll take you through the process of translating my ideas and research into a finished artwork, and a few reflections on the piece as a whole. The theme of this project is structural racism. But more specifically, it's about learning to see and understand white blindness to this issue. I want to begin with the title. The word intervisible comes from urban planning. Intervisibility is when objects are mutually visible from their locations in the landscape. A good example of it is the National Mall in Washington, D.C. When you're at the Lincoln Memorial, you can see the Washington Monument and vice versa. And when you're on Capitol Hill, you can see both. These objects are mutually visible to one another, so they're all intervisible. I'll come back to that idea later. The subtitle is Redlining and Blind Stitching in the Fabric of Greater Boston. First, what's redlining? This is an image of the red line map of Boston from the 1930s. In the 30s, as part of the New Deal, the federal government created an organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. Its purpose was to refinance home mortgages and to expand home buying opportunities to more Americans. Many people lost their homes to foreclosure during the Great Depression, and HOLC was supposed to help stop those foreclosures. Without ever declaring an intention to help white people and discriminate against people of color, that is how these maps were implemented. Red lines were drawn around neighborhoods where Black people lived, and the people there were denied financing. So now that I've explained a little bit about the title, I'd like to tell you why I decided to make this piece. I often tell my AP students they need to know their why. If you don't know why you care about your subject, it's hard to make anyone else care. When that happens, it shows. These two paintings are from a series I made based on my hometown of Needham. I used bright colors and simplified shapes to create playful and welcoming compositions. I painted them this way to express the friendly experience I have of living in my hometown with my family. And while I still feel this way, I also know that the reality they express is incomplete. The murders in 2012 and 2014 of the young Trayvon Martin and even younger Tamir Rice didn't happen in Needham, but they coincided with my own children reaching adolescence. Like so many people, my sadness was accompanied by a sense of utter powerlessness. I wanted to help, but I struggled with how I could best be of service in this situation. I could see that I needed to pay closer attention to the fact that my husband and I were raising our kids in a town where racial demographics hadn't changed much since I had grown up there in the 1970s and 1980s. To try to understand the situation better, I read books and listened to podcasts on the subject. Two books that made a huge impact on me were The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson and The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Through this research, I began to form a guiding question. How did I end up living and working in mostly white environments? One answer to that question is that the path of least resistance for a white person leads to a segregated life and to the invisibility of racism within that life. Another answer is that racist financial and governmental policies designed to benefit white people created this situation. Both things are true. Sometimes in towns like mine, people have difficulty engaging with Black History Month. They might say things like, "We really don't have any Black history here." I was learning that this is actually untrue. The purposeful segregation of our cities and suburbs is the story of race in these suburbs. If your town is mostly white, it isn't an accident. In 2019, there was an incident at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. A field trip designed by a middle school teacher to enrich the lives of her students went terribly wrong. The mostly Black kids were harassed by two white adults visiting the museum and separately by two staff members of the museum. In both cases, racially charged language was used. This happened at a time when I was on the Educators Advisory Board of the museum. As a member of the board, I had a responsibility to advise the museum on outreach to schools. This event hit me in two areas I care deeply about: students and open access to art. The museum was committed to addressing this incident, and during the sensitivity training that followed, someone remarked, "If Black people could fix structural racism without the involvement of white people, it would have been fixed long ago." It was that remark that made me understand that for change to happen, I needed to do more than agree that racism is bad. I needed to stop thinking of it as someone else's issue. Also, because it was a smaller incident in which nobody had died, I wasn't so overwhelmed by it. I felt I had not just the responsibility, but the opportunity to make a difference. So now I'll take you through some of my research. I wanted to look more deeply into the reasons my life had become so segregated, and I wanted to make my artwork more directly about this question. So I began by looking for information about any persons of color who may have lived in Needham before 1950. I shifted my research to places like the Needham Public Library, the Registry of Deeds here in Dedham, the Needham History Center and Museum, and online census and genealogy databases. In reading The Warmth of Other Suns, I had been introduced to the Green Book. Victor Green, an African-American mail carrier in New York City, self-published this guide to safe places for Black people to stay when traveling across America. It was used from the 1930s until the late 1960s to help find places where people of color could safely stop for gas, find a hotel, or get a meal. I found a PDF online of the 1938 edition of the Green Book, and I was surprised to discover that Needham, Massachusetts actually had a listing. The Needham House listed in the Green Book is pictured here. It was on Central Avenue near Volonte Farms. It was owned and run as an inn by a woman named Blanche Chapman. I would later learn that she and her 7 siblings grew up on Honeywell Street in Needham. Her father, Samuel Johns, bought this house on Central Ave in 1924 and sold it to Blanche and her husband. She would live there with her husband and eventually with her son and daughter-in-law into the 1970s. She operated this home as a traveler's inn for Black people. As I researched, I also began prototyping different ideas for this project. Early on in the process, I was still thinking about those paintings I made of my town. I made small, colorful paintings on cards, which I cut and folded to be pop-ups. I wanted to depict the buildings as false fronts to the financial system behind them. I also wanted to make connections between these buildings and the inequities in our country. So I literally used string to draw lines in space. The card houses were quite small, and I wanted to make them bigger. I considered making portraits of all the houses in the Massachusetts section of the Green Book. I started to do this first on heavy watercolor paper and then on wood. I collaged some of the census forms on the backs of these pieces. But I decided that making houses with false fronts didn't suit the Green Book houses. They weren't false fronts for racism. They were a lifeline. So my imagery and subject matter didn't quite match. I considered making the houses from embroidery because I started to think about the cotton industry as one root of financial inequality in America. But I didn't like the idea of hanging embroidery hoops in a gallery. In my next iteration, I 3D printed a house. I printed an enlarged version of the Monopoly house because that game seemed like a good reference for the story I was trying to tell. But 3D printing was too time consuming and used tons of materials. So I used a house I had 3D printed to create a silicone mold. The silicone is the blue material in this slide. Then I cast a house out of plaster to see if this was a better way to generate a bunch of little houses. It was doable, but they were heavy and still not quite what I was looking for. So I built a model of Blanche Chapman's house and rigged it with a remote controlled light. I laser cut her name and the information from the green book out of the base of the house so that it would project text onto the floor. Throughout this process, I sketched and drew my ideas. You can see on the left side an idea in which I deconstructed houses and suspended them from above. On the right page, you can see my ideas about walls and barriers were beginning to develop. I was thinking about how to guide people through the gallery space and lead them to a safe place. That safe place would be a model of a green book house. At this time, there was a lot in the news about traffic stops that went terribly wrong and ended in the deaths of Black motorists at the hands of police officers. I began to think about the barriers we create with road signs and fences to control where people can go. My research into American history kept returning me to the importance of cotton in our economic history. In Massachusetts, we think of Lowell Mills and New England's role in the Industrial Revolution. But when we look at old mill buildings that have been made into museums or condos, we don't always think about the fact that those buildings were built from the profits made from slave labor. I had also noticed a visual connection between the chain link cut out of paper and the lace patterns. Lace curtains were a mark of social class for Irish immigrants in the 19th and 20th century. And so I started researching lace. I wondered if there were any cotton lace designs that I could use. There were. Battenberg lace, pictured here, turned out to be perfect for me. It's an American design, which is unusual for lace. It's cotton, so it references the cotton industry. And the designer named it for Queen Victoria's daughter, Beatrice, when she married Prince Henry of Battenberg. And so it seemed to build in a sense of class striving. All the time that I was developing this piece, I was also looking for a gallery to host the exhibition. I submitted a proposal to the Bromfield Gallery and was invited to make a presentation to their board. The presentation went well, but the artist board members really pushed back on my work. They questioned my ability to represent a point of view that's not my own. They awarded me the solo show, but I knew their criticisms were valid. So now I had a venue and a deadline, but if I wanted to be true to the work, I needed to take their critique into consideration. Not because they had any authority over my concept, but because I could sense that they had pointed out a weakness in the piece. This is really important. Getting feedback and responding to criticism is a very effective way to improve your work. I met with several groups of artists. Some were specialists in particular materials I wanted to use. Others are trusted collaborators of many years. I was in regular conversation with Mr. K, our former middle school art teacher, and with my husband, who's also an artist. When creating something new, it's really important to get feedback from people you trust. Don't bother with the folks who aren't convinced about your project. It's an important distinction because there are people who will tear you down. I was focusing on the houses, which told an important story, but the piece seemed to be lacking the larger story of structural racism. I wanted to look at how I could miss something so obvious simply by paying attention to other things. When you get stuck in a creative project, it helps to go back to your original line of inquiry and do more research. I knew at this point that redlining was a big part of the answer, so I looked more deeply into it. Using the redline maps, banks gave low-interest government-insured loans to white homebuyers, while at the same time, they summarily rejected the loan applications of Black people. In the rare times a Black person was offered financing, it was at brutally high rates, which would often drive that person into foreclosure. Then, especially in cities, real estate developers would buy the properties in foreclosure at a deep discount, and rent them, often to the original owner, at rates that kept people in poverty. They often neglected the properties, creating slums in the inner cities throughout America. In the suburbs, Black people simply weren't allowed to buy property at all. Before the Great Migration, which began around 1916, the vast majority of Black people lived in the South. But as they moved out looking for a better life, these policies came into practice. Redlining isn't just one more example of a racist practice from times gone by. It's the machine that designed the segregation and financial inequality we still have today. It created intergenerational poverty for some people and an amazing engine of wealth for white middle-class homeowners. But redlining was also just part of one larger system. An important engine of the post-World War II economic boom was the GI Bill. When the greatest generation returned home from the war, the GI Bill provided veterans with college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance. Over 1 million African Americans fought in World War II, but Black veterans were more often than not denied these benefits. As a result, they and their families were denied an opportunity to join the middle class. Unlike all of you, when I was growing up, we didn't have this information in our textbooks. Even now, different states teach this material differently, if at all. Once I absorbed the implications, not just of redlining, but of the deletion of that history from education, I realized that this was what I needed to talk about. The Chapman House is a great story, but I was telling it from the outside. I tried to find Blanche Chapman's family. They no longer live in Needham. I didn't feel I could do that story justice without speaking with them and getting their perspective. This realization really stopped me in my tracks. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that my lack of awareness was the story I was best positioned to tell. And perhaps my journey would be something others could relate to. The blindness of white people to issues of racial inequity, and also the lack of understanding about how we got here, became my new guiding light. The house had been the centerpiece of the installation. Once I removed it, the walls became the focal point. Removing the house shifted the meaning of the piece from how people worked within an unjust system to the ways we failed to see the system at all. Now that I had decided on the elements of the artwork, I was ready to synthesize my ideas and materials into a final piece. I did one more round of research. This time I wanted to find imagery to represent the long legacy of the cotton industry. So I visited RISD's Nature Lab to draw from actual cotton samples. The drawings of cotton balls became some of the final images in the installation. I visited Lowell Mills to look at the physical shapes and forms of the looms, spinners, and of the spaces inside the mill. This model, which I came across at the Lowell Mills Museum, of a woman standing among the threads, essentially inside the workings of a large machine, struck me as an incredible metaphor for the experience of living inside a cultural system. I think of the cultural system I've been describing as a machine designed to produce unequal outcomes for Black and white people, and we are living inside the machine. I chose 5 symbols to represent the blindness I encountered in myself when it comes to structural racism. Cotton for the stolen people, profit, and labor that the Industrial Revolution in New England was built on. Chain link for the boundaries we erect in the suburbs as well as the cities. Cotton lace to represent the boundaries of social class, and also when used as a lace curtain, it's a divider between personal spaces and public space. The houses came back, but similar to my paintings, they were now simplified and arranged in groups. The houses are critical because this discrimination played out in the real estate markets, but also because it's where my personal choices intersect with this history. Some 20 plus years ago, my husband and I bought a house in a mostly white suburb of Boston. We bought in Needham because my extended family is there, but also because of the school system. Schools in communities like mine prepare students to go to college, and as you'll remember from the GI Bill, a college degree is a great way to increase one's lifelong earnings. But schools are funded by property taxes, which is why towns with expensive homes have better funded schools. The focus on college admissions creates higher home prices, which furthers the gap between the funding of city schools and suburban schools. Rather than use several college symbols, I appropriated the Harvard seal to represent the pinnacle of the college admissions arms race. I imported my drawings to Adobe Illustrator, and I used the lace pattern to create a visual structure for the whole design. Then I cut the designs out of 18 by 24-inch sheets of watercolor paper using the laser cutter here at Ursuline. I decided to use the Redline maps to represent the machine of racism. I knew that I wanted to arrange the space in the installation so that the lace panels would block one's view of the maps. Here you see 2 early prototypes for the map designs. I decided the maps would be made out of fabric to reference quilt making. American quilts are an art form shared by women, both Black and white, and quilts are often used to tell a story. Instead of a traditional quilt, I decided to use only the batting. Batting is the material on the inside of quilts. By leaving the batting uncovered, I had a metaphor for exposing the inside of this part of American history. I drew the maps onto the batting and cut it into the shapes on the Redline maps. Then I hand dyed each section. Here you see it drying on laundry racks in my basement. I wrote the map's original letter and number codes onto pieces of plastic and pinned them to the fabric before dyeing it to help me later reassemble the map like a jigsaw puzzle. Here you can see Mrs. Cutter and Mr. K helping me to pin the fabric back together in the winter of 2019. In the inset photos, you can see how I rolled up the pinned fabric and then stitched it together at my home on my sewing machine. To make sure the piece would fit in the gallery, I built a scale model. My husband helped me work with SketchUp to build a 3D model of the space, and with a special shout out to our former colleague, Greg Mertz, who put the model into our virtual reality system so that I could walk around in the space. I decided that everything in the piece would be made of cotton. The string that hangs it, the fabric, the thread that sewed the fabric together, and the paper panels are all cotton. As I started to assemble the pieces of the installation, I finally got to see the shadows cast by the lace panels. I think of the shadows as the dark side of our misguided attention. We get distracted by the environment built from the lace panels, never noticing the inequality that's built into the system. While we go about our business, those panels cast dark shadows on the walls, the floor, and on the people walking through the space. Finally, in March of 2020, the show opened at Bromfield Gallery in Boston. Here you see Ms. Lyons, Mr. K, and Mrs. Judd at the opening reception. And now I want to share with you a few thoughts about the finished installation. It's my hope that I've created an experience that serves as a metaphor for white blindness to structural racism. The small moments of color remind me of the flashpoints we experience in the news when another racist atrocity occurs. If we stay inside our comfortable spaces, we will only ever see these periodic events and feel the injustice for a brief moment. But in the installation space, you have the opportunity to go closer to the maps. And once you do, I'm hopeful that you might begin to recognize the policies that created the segregated and financially unequal outcomes we see today. Now that you understand the title of this piece a little better than before, the way that our land was sliced up and stitched together to isolate and separate Black people and white people, and to give financial advantages to white people. I'd like to think that the word intervisible can be used to describe our efforts to accurately see our positions within the culture. And with greater understanding, we can work together to eliminate systems of injustice. I want to thank President Levesque for really championing me bringing this artwork to Ursuline, also Principal Patron, Mr. Ziska, Mrs. Glancy, and Mr. McManus for their support and their help with logistics. To the faculty who subbed for me, Ms. Laranjera and Ms. Utzman for their help, Manali, Mrs. Fazekas, and Mrs. Reynolds for taking video and pictures and for getting the word out about the show, to the IT department, particularly Rob Hillman for helping me with the tech, and Angela Hall, to all the facilities guys for arranging Angela Hall, but most especially to Christian and Gary who operated the lift and tied tons of little strings to hooks in the ceiling. And a very, very special thank you to all the students who helped assemble the pieces of the installation. We only have a few more minutes, but if anyone has questions, I would be delighted to try to answer them for you.
Okay. Helen, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. So like in all, how long did this installation take you?
How long did this take? It's always the first question. It took about 2 years, start to finish, from conception to the Bromfield Gallery. But I count in that 2-year period, all those things I was figuring out and hadn't really decided what I was going to do. So about half the time was in research and development and about half the time was actually producing the final piece. Someone asked, can you walk through it? Yes, you will have the opportunity to walk through it. I think Principal Patron is sending out a message after this period to tell teachers when they can go through. It'll be lit up from about 10 to 2 during the school day, and I think you'll have classes bring you through. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.